It is the 9th of September, 1965. A single-seat attack jet is screaming low over a village in North Vietnam when anti-aircraft fire tears into it and the engine dies. The pilot ejects. He is going to come down in the middle of a hostile town, and in the few seconds the parachute gives him, he says something out loud, to himself, into the wind. He says, 5 years down there at least. I'm leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. He had read one philosophy book in his life. In the next 8 years, in a cell, it would be the only thing he had left, and it would be enough. His name is James Bond Stockdale. In the autumn of 1965, he is a U.S. Navy commander, 41 years old, a fighter pilot and a wing commander, flying combat missions off an aircraft carrier in the Gulf of Tonkin. He is, by every measure his world recognizes, a man at the top of his profession. He flies the most advanced machines his country can build. He commands other men. He is precise, technical, decorated, in control. He belongs entirely, as he himself put it, to the world of technology, a world of instruments and checklists and solvable problems, a world where competence is rewarded and effort produces results. But a few years earlier, between deployments, Stockdale had gone back to school. The Navy had sent him to study at Stanford University, and there, almost by accident, he had wandered into philosophy. A professor handed him a small book and told him it might interest him. The book was the Enchiridion, the handbook, the distilled teaching of the Roman Stoic Epictetus, the teaching of a man born a slave, a man whose own leg had been ruined in captivity. Stockdale read it, and by his own account, he did not just read it, something in it lodged. He carried its central idea around with him for years afterward, the way you carry a key whose lock you have not yet found. The idea that there is a hard, absolute line between what is up to us and what is not, and that nearly everything we fear lies on the far side of that line. On the 9th of September, 1965, Stockdale found the lock. His jet is hit. He ejects. The opening shock of the parachute and the rough landing badly injure his leg. He comes down in the village street with a leg that, like Epictetus's, will never fully work again. He is beaten by a crowd before soldiers take him, and as he is dragged away, the technical world, the world of instruments and competence and control, simply ends. Everything he had been good at is now irrelevant. The aircraft is gone. The rank means nothing here. The checklists do not apply. He is, suddenly and totally, a man with nothing but the contents of his own mind. And the most useful thing in that mind, it turned out, was a thin book by a dead slave. To understand how a Roman handbook keeps a man alive in a Vietnamese prison, you have to understand the one sentence Stockdale built everything on. It is the sentence Epictetus put at the very front of the Enchiridion. Some things are up to us, and some things are not up to us. Up to us, our judgments, our intentions, our own responses, the inside of our own will. Not up to us, the body and what is done to it, reputation, circumstance, other people, the entire outer world. Stockdale had read that line years before in a sunlit library. Now he was going to test it in conditions Epictetus himself would have recognized. The prison the Americans bitterly nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton was not, primarily, a place of casual brutality. It was something more deliberate than that, and Stockdale understood the distinction precisely because it mattered. His captors were not simply trying to hurt him. They were trying to use him. They wanted a propaganda asset, a confession, a statement condemning the war, a filmed appearance, an interview with a visiting delegation, a senior American officer saying the words they needed said. Their entire system, the isolation, the ropes, the leg irons, the years of it, was an engine built for one purpose: to reach inside a man and take hold of his will, to make him choose with his own mouth to say the thing. And here is where Epictetus's line stopped being an interesting idea and became the load-bearing wall of a man's survival. Because the line told Stockdale exactly where the war was actually being fought. His captors controlled the entire second column, and there was no pretending otherwise. They controlled his body, whether it was fed, whether it was whole, whether it was in irons. They controlled his location, his information, whether he ever saw daylight, whether he ever went home. All of it was theirs. But the line told him, with the cold authority of something he had decided was true years before, in calm, that there was one thing their entire apparatus could not actually seize. It could only ask for it. His assent, the inner act of yes. They could break the leg. They could not, without his own cooperation, break the man, because the thing they actually needed was a thing only he could hand them. Stockdale wrote long afterward that Epictetus had given him in advance the most important piece of equipment he carried into that prison. Not hope, not a strategy, a map of the battlefield, a clear, pre-drawn line showing him which ground was already lost and not worth grieving, the comfort, the freedom, the body's safety, the timeline, and which single ridge of ground was still his and was therefore the only ground worth defending with everything he had. He stopped deliberately, spending his strength mourning the second column, the captivity itself, the injustice of it, the lost years. Those were weather. He spent every reserve he had defending the first column. The line did not make the prison less real. It told him where, inside the prison, he was still standing on his own land. Let me make the line concrete the way Stockdale himself had to, because in that prison it was never abstract for a single hour. Suppose you are facing the certainty of an interrogation. If your whole inner state is staked on the second column, on not being hurt, on getting out soon, on the war ending, on rescue coming, then you have handed every one of those controls to men who wish you harm. Your peace is now their property. They can take it at will, simply by doing what they were always going to do anyway. Stockdale's discipline, drawn straight from the handbook, was to refuse that, to say, the pain is coming, and the pain is theirs to give. The release date is theirs. The war is theirs. I release all of it. But the question of what I will and will not consent to say, what I will sign, what I will perform, what I will betray, that question is mine. It is the one thing in this cell that was never on their side of the line. And so that is where I will spend everything I have. Not on the impossible project of not suffering, on the possible project of not consenting. But here is where Stockdale's story breaks away from a simple tale of one stubborn man and becomes something larger and, I think, far more important. Because Epictetus also taught that a person has roles, parts in a play, son, citizen, neighbor, and in Stockdale's case, the most demanding role of all. He was the senior ranking officer. By rank, by date of commission, James Stockdale was the commanding officer of every captured American in that prison system. And so the first column, the territory of his own will, turned out not to be a private retreat at all. It was a command post. The discipline was never going to be only for himself. The prisoners were held mostly in isolation, deliberately cut off from one another, because a frightened, confused man alone is far easier to break than a man who knows he is part of an organized body. So the prisoners built, in silence, an organization the walls were not supposed to allow. They communicated through the stone itself, with a simple grid code tapped knuckle against wall. A quiet, patient rhythm passed cell to cell, year after year, under the hearing of the guards. And through that tapping, Stockdale, the senior officer, did something extraordinary. He governed. He issued a set of rules, a code of conduct for resistance, so that no man would have to face the interrogators alone, improvising, with no idea what was expected of him. And the rules Stockdale tapped through those walls are, when you look closely, pure applied Epictetus. The dividing line turned into a survivable practice for frightened, suffering men. The central principle was this: under sufficient torture, a human body will eventually yield. A man can be made to say things. And to demand that every prisoner hold out forever, absolutely, against any pressure, was not heroism. It was a cruelty that would simply break good men and leave them drowning in shame. So the line Stockdale drew and tapped cell to cell was humane and exact. Take torture. Make them work for every single thing. Hold to the last physical limit of what your body can bear. And then, when the body has truly reached its end and something is given up, do not collapse into despair. Recover, bounce back, reset to the line, and resist again from there, the next day. He was telling dozens of isolated, terrified men exactly what Epictetus had told his students. Your captors own your body and what it can be forced to do. They do not own your will. And your will includes the decision, made fresh each morning, to begin resisting again. Think about what that did. It took the unbearable, isolating weight of perfect resistance off every individual man, the impossible standard that breaks people and then makes them hate themselves for breaking, and that replaced it with something a human being could actually carry. You are not required to be unbreakable. No body is unbreakable. You are required to make them pay, to hold to your limit, and then to come back. A man who has been broken once is not finished. He is simply a man who resets to the line and resists again. Stockdale, from inside his own cell, in his own pain, used a Roman slave's philosophy to give an entire prison population something that torture had been specifically designed to destroy. Not freedom. He could not give them that. He gave them a structure, a line they all held together. In the autumn of 1969, Stockdale's captors decided to use him directly. They informed him he was going to be put in front of foreign visitors. He was going to be filmed. A senior American officer, presented to the world looking healthy, calm, well-treated, a piece of propaganda with his face on it. The order touched the exact center of the line. They could compel his body into the room. They could not, on their own, compel the image. They needed him to look usable. And so Stockdale did something that is very hard to describe without the words sounding insane, and which is, I think, one of the most lucid acts in the whole history of the resistance. He destroyed the asset. He took a stool and beat his own face with it. He cut his own scalp. He deliberately and methodically wrecked his own appearance so that there was no possibility of filming a healthy, contented American officer, because the healthy, contented American officer was the thing they needed, and it was the one thing he could still deny them. When that was not enough, on another occasion, learning that the torture of his men was being escalated to break him specifically, he cut into himself with a piece of glass, a clear signal to his captors that he would die before he would be used, that the asset would destroy itself entirely rather than be spent. And the historical record indicates that it worked. The brutal, systematic torture in that prison eased after that period. The captors had been shown in blood the limit of what their engine could produce. Now, I want to stop because you should be feeling resistance to this. This sounds like the opposite of stoic calm. It sounds frantic. It sounds like a man losing control, harming himself in a state of crisis. Is this really philosophy, or is it just a desperate man cracking? And the answer is the whole point of this episode, so I want to be precise. What Stockdale did was not a loss of control. It was the most extreme imaginable assertion of it. Look exactly at where he aimed the act. He did not aim it at his captors. He could not defeat them. The second column was entirely theirs. He did not aim it at the walls or the war or fortune. He aimed the act with surgical precision at the single thing on his side of the line, his own body, his own choices. And he used his absolute authority over that one territory to make himself useless to them. It was not panic. It was Epictetus's dividing line, followed all the way to its furthest and darkest conclusion. They owned everything they could take by force. They did not own the one thing they actually needed, his cooperation, and he proved it to them in the only language their engine could read. The calm of the Stoic was never the absence of extreme action. It was the presence of an absolutely clear head about which ground was his. Stockdale's head in that moment was completely clear. That is exactly why the act was so terrible and so effective. Here is the heart of it. Years later, after the war, after he had come home, Stockdale was asked a question, and his answer is the most important thing he ever said, and the reason this story is on this channel. He was asked, who did not make it out? Who were the prisoners who did not survive that captivity intact? And the answer, as a writer named Jim Collins later recorded it, was not the one anyone expects. Stockdale said, it was the optimists. The optimists did not make it. Read that again, slowly, because it overturns almost everything our culture tells you about surviving hardship. The optimists. Stockdale explained what he meant. The optimists were the men who said, we will be home by Christmas. And Christmas would come, and Christmas would go, and they were still in the cell. So they would say, we will be home by Easter. And Easter would come and go. And then by Christmas again. And in Stockdale's own stark words, they died of a broken heart. They had staked their entire inner survival on an outcome in the second column, a release date, that they did not control and could not predict. And each time the date arrived and the door did not open, a piece of them broke until there was nothing left to break. And so Stockdale gave what is now sometimes called the Stockdale paradox, though it is really just Epictetus, paid for in 8 years of a man's life. He said you must do two things at once, and you must never confuse them. First, you must retain absolute faith that you will prevail in the end, that you will get out, that you will turn the experience into something that defines you rather than destroys you. That faith is non-negotiable. Without it, you have already lost. But second, and at the very same time, you must confront, with total honesty, the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they are. You hold the faith in the eventual outcome, and you absolutely refuse to attach that faith to a date, to a timeline, to any specific event your captors control. You will prevail. You do not know when. And you stop completely demanding to know when, because the demand to know when is precisely the thing that killed the optimists. Look at how exactly that maps onto the dividing line. The eventual outcome that Stockdale kept faith in, prevailing, enduring, making it mean something. That is, in the deepest sense, a first column matter. It is about who he would choose to be, all the way through, and what he would refuse to surrender. That faith was his, and no one could revoke it. But the date, the timeline, by Christmas, by Easter, that is pure second column. That belongs to the war, to politics, to forces in distant rooms. The optimists made the fatal error of staking a first column thing, their will to survive, on a second column variable, the release date. And the second column betrayed them, the way it always eventually does. Stockdale survived because he kept those two things rigorously separate. Unbreakable faith in the part that was his, clear-eyed, unflinching acceptance of the part that was not. That is not optimism. It is not pessimism. It is the dividing line, drawn under the worst pressure a human being can face, and holding. So how does a person actually use this? Without a prison, without a war. Because the structure of Stockdale's ordeal, stripped of its extremity, is the structure of every long hardship a human being faces. The grinding illness with no clear end, the recovery that takes years, the crisis whose resolution depends on rooms you will never be allowed into. Any hard thing where you cannot see the far side and cannot make it come sooner. And for all of those, the Stockdale practice is concrete and small and available. First, identify your Christmas. Find the date you have secretly, dangerously attached your survival to, the deadline by which this will surely be over, the milestone after which everything will be fine. We all build one. It feels like hope. It is actually a fault line, and Stockdale watched it kill men. So name it, and then deliberately detach. Not from the faith that you will come through. Keep that, hold that. That is the first column, and it is yours. Detach only the faith from the date. Say to yourself plainly, I will get through this, and I do not know when. And I am no longer going to demand to know when, because that demand is the thing that breaks people. Second, the brutal facts. Sit down in a calm hour and look directly at the actual current reality of your situation. Not the catastrophized version, not the version sweetened by the Christmas story, the real one. How bad it actually is. How long it might actually take. What is genuinely lost. The honest, unflattering, fully detailed truth. Stockdale's insight is that this clear sight is not despair. It is the opposite of despair. Despair is what ambushes the man who refused to look when reality finally forces itself on him. The man who has already looked fully cannot be ambushed. He has already absorbed the worst of it in the daylight with steady hands, and so he can now spend his strength not on shock, but on the only question that was ever his to answer. And third, the reset. This is the part drawn straight from the rules Stockdale tapped through the walls. You will have bad days inside the long hardship. You will, some days, lose ground. You will be discouraged. You will give something up. You will fail to be the person you wanted to be. The optimist treats each such day as evidence that the whole thing is hopeless and breaks a little more. The Stockdale discipline treats it as nothing of the kind. A bad day is not a verdict. It is a single day. You took ground. Some ground was lost. The body and the mind have limits, and they were reached. And then, this is the entire technique. The next morning, you reset to the line, and you resist again from there. Not unbroken. Nobody is unbroken. Simply unfinished. A person who, every single morning, stands up off the floor and begins the resistance again. That, and not invulnerability, is what carried James Stockdale through 7.5 years. The willingness, each new morning, to begin again from the line. It would be dishonest to end without naming the hard part. Because Stockdale's story, told carelessly, can curdle into something false and even cruel. It can be flattened into a simple slogan. Just be tough. Just have the right mindset. Mind over matter. As if the prison did not really matter. As if a strong enough will makes suffering irrelevant. That is a misreading, and it dishonors both Stockdale and every man who was in those cells with him. It is worth refusing plainly. Stockdale never said the suffering did not matter. He confronted the brutal facts. That was half of his entire paradox. The torture was real. The injuries were permanent. He limped, like Epictetus, for the rest of his life. Men died. Men were broken in ways that did not heal. Stockdale himself was clear, always, that he had been broken too, that no one held out forever, that the engine could make any body yield. The dividing line was never a claim that the prison was not a prison. It was the opposite. It was a clear-eyed acceptance that the prison was completely, brutally real, and a refusal, on top of that acceptance, to also hand over the one last thing the prison could not take by force. The toughness was never a denial of the pain. It was a decision about where, inside the pain, a man would still draw a line and stand. And the rules he tapped through the walls were built around mercy, not machismo, built on the explicit understanding that good men break, and that the measure of a man was never whether he broke, but whether he got up the next morning and reset to the line. You are not asked to feel no pain. You are asked to stay clear about which ground is yours and to come back to it every morning for as long as it takes. That is the teaching. Everything else is commentary. James Stockdale was released from the Hanoi prison system in February of 1973 after 7.5 years, 4 of them in solitary confinement, 2 of them in leg irons. He walked off the aircraft that carried the prisoners home on a ruined leg, upright. He went on to become a vice admiral and later, in his old age, a scholar, a man who lectured and wrote about the philosophy that had kept him intact. He spent the rest of his life telling people about a small book by a Roman slave, a man who had also limped, who had also been the property of a system that wanted to use him, and who had drawn, 2,000 years earlier, the line that saved a Navy pilot's mind. And that is why this story belongs beside the ancient ones. Because it is the proof that the dividing line is not a museum piece. It is not a charming artifact of antiquity. It was carried in one man's memory out of a sunlit library and into the worst place his century could build. And it held. It worked. It did, under maximum load, exactly what Epictetus said it would do. The captors took the entire second column. They never reached the first. And the man came home. And you do not need to be shot down over a war to use this. You only need to be a person inside some long, hard, open-ended thing and willing today to do the 3 small acts. To name the Christmas you have staked yourself on and gently detach your faith from the date. To look with steady hands at the brutal facts of where you actually are. And then, tomorrow morning, when it is hard again, to stand up off the floor, reset to the line, and begin the resistance once more from the one narrow ground that was always and only and entirely yours. Stone and iron. Thank you for sitting with this one. If essays like this are useful to you, the channel is here for them. Subscribe if you want more.